Welcome to Generations, a show for seniors, people who know seniors, or people who someday will become seniors. I'm David Lapacqua, and I'll be your host for this episode of Generations. Today, we're going to be looking backward in time, looking at the past, both things that are kind of irrelevant and unimportant by current standards, but more importantly, things that have stayed with us for decades and decades that are out of the past. I'd like to introduce our co-hosts to start. And I'm going to ask each of them for something that we have certainly forgotten about from the past, and it's probably just as well. And I'll start by mentioning the very thing we're doing right now, appearing on screens. There was a time, younger people don't realize this, when television didn't exist after a certain time of day. You had to get away from screens, and at 1 in the morning they would play the national anthem and show the US flag, and then they would sign off for the evening, and you couldn't watch TV at 2 or 3 in the morning. But anything that you could remember that doesn't exist anymore, that someone born in this century would not know about or have a reason to understand. And so first, let's start with Candy Pettiford, who always is the most glamorous looking of our group. And Candy, how are you? And is there one thing you can think about that is basically irrelevant and has been lost in time?
Well, I'm doing great, David. I'm glad you asked me that question. I was just going to just throw out, this is not going to be what I'm going to talk about, but I'm just going to throw out cassette tapes.
Hmm.
Who uses cassette tapes anymore? I mean, it's a CD or MP3 or whatever, but cassette tapes have gone by, even though I've kept some, they've gone by the wayside.
I've got a few hundred. I'll sell them for a nickel
Oh,
or less. So anyway, thank you, Candy. Then we have Nadia Giordana. How are you? And can you think of something that no longer exists that 21st century people do not know about?
Well, I'm delighted to be here today, and this is going to be fun and interesting. Yes, similar to Candy, only perhaps 5 or 10 years farther back, 8-track tape cassettes,
um,
the really big clunky ones.
uh,
I remember people having huge libraries, music libraries of
uh,
those 8-track cassette tapes.
Yeah, good example. Then we have Rashida Jenkins. Rashida, you're the youngest of our group. You don't go back 50 years, but you go back pretty close to that. Anything from the 20th century that you think people might not know about who are a Generation Z people?
Well, hello, and I'm excited to be here. So for me, it's VHS videotapes. I have tons of boxes in my basement right now of VHS videotapes that no longer have any use.
Yeah, I've had some of the VHS tapes converted to thumb drives, and it's expensive, but it's been really helpful to get past them because they take up a lot of space, and I haven't known what to do with them.
No kidding.
Finally, we have Mike Rosberg, who certainly qualifies as one who's one of the older members of the group, like me. And Mike, what's something you remember from the 20th century that most young people would not know about?
Well, they might know about it logically, but not practically. And that is the fact that on your television set, there were originally three channels: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And then it seems so odd that a fourth one came along, which was Fox. But the impact that had was to sort of give people something in common to talk about at the water fountain, as Nadia said to me the other day. Whereas today, everybody is watching something else, and they have so little in common to talk about in that respect.
Very much a different world that way. And again, we could devote an entire program just to that, but we're going to try to flip it and look at things in the past that did have an impact on us and have an impact to this day. We've sort of titled it tentatively A Half Century Past and Still Present. And so sometimes we have a featured guest, sometimes we have a panel discussion. Today it's the latter. And so as I and the co-hosts are going to try to look backward in time to our most important cultural memories, not those unimportant ones that are in the dustbins of time, but things that have stayed with us, cultural events. It could be a TV show, it could be a book or a poem home, could be an event or a song or an album or a musical group, but something that, even though it happened many decades ago, can still affect us today, and it's hung with us today, and helps us understand who we are and what the world is like. And so let's go around again and see if there's some impactful memories that people have from the distant past. And Candy, I introduced you first. Let's see what is on your mind, and the floor is yours for a while. Talk about
All
things that
right.
really made a difference.
Well, maybe I'll say the sky is mine because I was a flight attendant for Northwest Airlines. And at that time, we were able to smoke on the plane. And every time I got home, I could not bring my uniform inside. I had to leave it outside because it stunk the whole house up. And then when I would go to the doctor says, I hear you kind of wheezing. Were you ever a smoker? And I said, yes and no. The doctor said, it's either yes or no, ma'am. I said, well, let me explain to you. Then when I explained, he said, I understand. Secondhand smoke. I said, I got it all the time. So when we were going to a restaurant, they were saying no smoking. Go smoking sections. The whole restaurant was smoking. So I am glad they cut that out.
Yeah, and younger people have no memory of the
No.
the impact. Even I'll tell some of my current students, because I'm still teaching part-time at Augsburg University, that in some college classes, people did smoke during class. And they're kind of shocked just to hear that. But it was the late 60s, early 70s, and that was just a part of life, and people were totally okay with it. And now it's a totally different environment, and of course, for the good. Any
Well,
other
think
comments
about the
about
TV shows.
Candy's
Think
example?
about TV shows. Like Columbo and whatever. Everybody would light up a cigarette or something. They don't do that now on these new movies. You don't see them smoking.
Yeah,
Is it true, David, that even the professors would smoke while they're teaching the class?
some did. I had one who actually, an English professor, who used to smoke during class, and then one day a representative of the department came to the next class session and said, "Sorry to report that your instructor died last night of a heart attack." And so
No.
we're finding a
Oh,
replacement. I thought, well, maybe there's a connection here, but
Yeah.
no, that was not uncommon. It did happen.
Yeah.
Candy, any other examples of beside that one that you wanted to bring up
oh,
of?
that's a hitter for me.
Okay. Nadia, anything from your past that has remained impactful to this day?
Yes, I have several, but I've got two I'll talk about right now early on in the show to make sure we have enough time. There were two movies that had a lifelong impact on me. The first one in a more fun way, and actually is so well suited to our title, 50 years past and still present. 2001, A Space Odyssey. HAL, the computer that became sentient, and how that computer, the more and more it became more human and then tried to save itself and fought for its life, is so relevant today with AI coming along as it has been. And I remember when he was about to unplug Hal, and in that kind of weak little voice, he said, "Will I dream?"
Mhm.
And it just breaks your heart because you feel like the thing is alive. It certainly was sentient, but it also had that, just like humans, that darker side when it was selfishly killing to preserve its own life. And I never thought I'd see that in my lifetime, that people were having that discussion seriously, but there it is. And there was another one, and I don't know who here would even remember this. Mike kind of remembered the name. David, I don't know if you do. If anybody remembers, and I had to, if anybody remembers A Clockwork Orange.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I just looked it up this morning because I really don't remember much of the premise other than it was a dystopian society. And I don't know anything about the character other than he was molded by the society, and I don't know, eventually he gave in, but uh the at that age, fresh off the farm, early in my 20s, when that movie came out, I went to the theater to be entertained. I had no idea I would barely be able to walk as I go out that door. The fear it instilled in me of home invasions, there was so much violence and brutality in that. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. It stayed with me, and I will never sit down and watch that movie. It might not even faze me at all at this point, but that was the effect that it had on me at that time.
I mentioned a very similar experience I had, and that is that as a kid, I watched like Frankenstein and
Yes.
those kind of movies, and they were actually kind of fun. So when I was about 20, I went to see this, I think, independently made film that was supposed to be a horror film, I heard, and it actually was very literally so, very graphic. And I was really grossed out, and I have never since that time gone to a horror movie. So had an effect.
Have a common theme here, the impact of mass media on our world. And your first example, Nadia, involving artificial intelligence has really ramped up as something that we're very much mindful of. And I don't think we even have begun to appreciate its impact. I know there was some movie about 20 years ago, and I can't remember the name of it, where a guy enters a shopping mall and there's a post on the shopping mall that says, "Hey, Tim, welcome here. Your birthday's coming up in a couple weeks. Have you thought about what you'd like to get?" And it's like, I thought this was an absurd idea that you could walk into a shopping mall in the future and someone at the mall would recognize you personally. But now with facial recognition technology and all this stuff, that's the reality of the world, you know. So the impact of mass media on our sense of the future, I think, is a very interesting issue. Anything else about Nadia's examples? Well, let's turn to Rashida Jenkins, the babe in the woods of this group. You can just see it on her face, that youthful glow. But she has a few years behind her and a fair amount of life experience. What's something that you remember from the past that has stayed with you?
So for me, I'm going to speak to a half a century ago, which, well, a half a century. So a quarter of a century. 25 years ago was 1999. And if we remember the Y2K scare, where they talked about computers and software would just, and the infrastructure would just fall and crumble, and everybody was stocking up on food and water, and we just thought the end of the world was going to happen in the year 2000. And then Prince, he wrote a song, 1999, that said, "We're going to party like it's 1999," because, of course, the world was going to end. So everybody was, living life with no regard because there would be no tomorrow. Um, and another really important thing that happened in 1999 was the Columbine High School massacre. And so, how that reflects to today is my son is now a sixth grader, and they make them do shutdown drills at school where they have to practice if there was an intruder, what they would do in that case. And so, even though that was 25 years ago, it still impacts today.
Yeah. You mentioned Prince song 1999. I think that was written in 1984. And I remember when I first heard it, I thought 1999. Yeah, that's off of the distant future. When will that ever happen? So
Yes.
1984 was kind of an interesting film too, as I recall, or else a book.
But both, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it is both. Yes.
well, Mike Rosberg, what out of your past has stayed with you that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I remember within our society, the Beatles were a great thing, and not only for their music, but for some of their worldviews. John, for example, was a free thinker, and the song Imagine had quite a lot of play. George was interested in Eastern religion, and I think a lot of the kind of the subculture, the young subculture, became interested in that too. And I remembered I took a yoga class. And then, of course, maybe most importantly of all was Ringo, who taught us all about Octopus's Garden, which, you know, just lasted for such a long time. But one other thing I would like to mention is a particular movie, which it was very popular at the time and had made a very interesting philosophical point, I thought, and that was called Blow Up. And in that movie, there was a photographer that was his profession. He was out and he ended up taking a picture of something he saw over in the corner of the film. He got into a studio, he magnified it, looked this way, that way, and he determined that there was a woman, and I can still see this image of her with one arm on a man laying on the ground and like trying to grab attention. He eventually went around trying to find out more. He thought he saw a picture of the woman going into a thing and he took a picture, but when the picture came back, she wasn't there.
What was the name of the film again, Mike?
Blow Up, BLOWUP.
It's one of those movies where technology and unpiecing a mystery was the center of the whole movie, you know, and ways that we can learn things through technology that we had never realized were there. And in this case, something is happening that the casual observer does not understand until he keeps processing and reprocessing these photos.
Yeah, and what happens at the end of the film is that the photographer is walking along, you know, living his normal life, and he sees a tennis court where there are several people dressed up as mimes, where they have like black and white shirts and, you know, white pants and all this. And he thinks, I don't know about that. But one of them then, they pretend they're playing tennis, and one of them hits something like this and it goes over or flies off the tennis court and lands by the photographer. And he just kind of goes, but then he thinks about it and he ends up picking up the invisible ball and throwing it back on the court.
Nice.
He's saying that, you know, with all these horrible things, well, there is something absurd about it all. And we can just get away from it as best we can.
I think the big idea is a lot of those movies changed our sense of reality, where in the old days, things were pretty straightforward. There was a family, something happened, somebody got killed, there was a problem in the family or something. But these were, you know, movies like The Matrix or Blow Up or 2001 Space Odyssey were really playing with our sense of reality. And that hadn't happened until probably the mid to late 20th century. Anything else?
What about the Brady Bunch and My Three Sons, Marcus Welby, all those old, those are really way out there old time shows.
Yeah, but I think the way they stayed with us is we realized that that's not what real families are like.
That's right.
It's a romanticized portrayal of a family that does not exist. And so I think that was part of what we had to go through, was to see that, but then to be offered alternatives to that. A show like All in the Family, which portrayed in the 70s, was one that affected me because it didn't cater to that mythology that families were just wonderful and perfect and that sort of thing. Other thoughts about any of these examples?
And another area of things that shook us out of our innocence was the rise of cults and the things that came up over the years, like Jim Jones and the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate. Those two were was a couple of the biggest ones. What happened in Waco, Texas? Those things robbed us of an innocence that, and the world changed after those things.
Yeah, and it seems to have been like in the mid to late 60s when a lot of this stuff was happening. And I should try to answer my own prompt, and I'll give you a somber example and a more frivolous example. But we were just in Memphis, Tennessee about 10 days ago, and there's the National Civil Rights Museum there, and it's housed on the very property where Martin Luther King was assassinated. So
Oh,
they've
wow.
kept the Lorraine Motel and his room 306,
I've been there.
exactly as it was in 1968 when he was killed. But then they've expanded it to the whole issue of civil rights and lunch counter demonstrations and freedom riders and everything. And it's very depressing to go there and realize how impactful this has been on our understanding of equality and human rights and that sort of thing. But it's a somber sort of place to be. On the other hand, in the more frivolous, I have been very much inspired by things that happened about 50 years ago that were people who colored outside the lines. And with television, for example, I think the show Laugh-In and the show Saturday Night Live helped free up my thinking a little bit about you could be wild and wacky and crazy. You didn't have to have the same predictable humor lines or anything. It was an inventive, adventurous period of time. And so I really appreciated when television finally got real in that manner.
One show I recall that I still watch because in its own way it's kind of fun was Our Miss Brooks, which was in the 1950s. And what was so different about it is that teachers were sexually harassing one another just left and right. And the teacher would come in and he'd say, "Hey, honey," to Miss Brooks. And, it was just all over the place, even amongst the teachers, much less the students. So that has changed in schools.
Yeah. And it's hard to watch those things without that realization, just as it would be hard to go into a college classroom where everyone was smoking cigarettes. It just is the sort of thing where we have our sensibilities have changed, and mostly in a good way, depending on what issue we're talking about. And so all of those old media messages were a reminder of how uninformed we were about a number of different things. Other comments from our panelists today?
We have definitely evolved. I know that The Matrix was a movie that came out in 1999. It talked about how you take a pill and you choose to go through, the matrix, and that's when life was real. And, you could do things that, your mind didn't really expand to. And so now when we think about those kind of things, when you've got AI, as Nadia had mentioned, where you've got those cameras that can come on your face and you can actually be inside the matrix, in other words. So,
And how that played off of Alice in Wonderland. It really was a twofold effect there. And another thing I thought of, there was another movie that helped turn the corner of our attitudes in society towards mental illness and how we handle people and whether we lock them up anymore or not. But One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a powerful, powerful movie, and that there are scenes that have stayed with me forever.
Jack Nicholson.
Well, I think for the better, our thinking about a lot of different issues has become more sophisticated, more nuanced, more complex. And so in the old days, we just had crazy people, insane people. We just had boys and girls. There was good and bad, and it was very clearly defined. And I think we've come to realize that life is more complicated than that, and that we can't just assign people labels and categories and be done with it. And I think in the old days, a lot of the typecasting that was done in television, for example, was very much that way, that men were a certain way, women were a certain way, people of color were a certain way. And it was sort of like, I think we've liberated ourselves a bit from that, not entirely, but our understanding of all of these things is a lot more nuanced in a good way than I think it was in the past.
Well, let's think about phones. What about phones? You had the dial, remember? And they did a trick on these young people where they said, try to text. And they kept trying to dial and they couldn't find it. They said, well, maybe you got to call the operator and text. It was really funny. They did not know how to use an old phone to text. So that's really out.
Yeah.
What about playground equipment? How many of us survived getting hit in the head with a swing board and
Oh,
as you're popping off of it, or swing too high and fly
yeah.
too far?
How about sand? They no longer have sand at the playground. Now it's wood chip.
Really? Yeah.
So
What was wrong with sand?
I don't know. That's a great question. But they no longer have sand at the playground.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, as we enter our last minute or so, any final quick comments from the group?
well, let's hear something from you, David. We haven't heard much from you.
Well, I don't like to dominate things too much, try to coordinate more than run the show in a different way. But I think the big idea is that memories really do matter. And I know sometimes old people are faulted for just being living in the past, but I think it's by confronting the past and understanding what we went through that today our lives are either better or more clearly understood. And I think that's all for the good. And I think if we forget about our past, we are losing a very important link to understanding ourselves and understanding the world. And I think that's what we've seen in the last 50 years is a huge transformation in the way that we think about things. And it's due to all of these various cultural events that have been part of our world, whether it be music or movies or books or whatever. With that, I suppose we should move toward closure here. I hope our audience will begin to think about their memories a little bit more and what memories have really defined us and stayed with us and have made a difference for us because events don't just happen and then end. They have their own residual impact. It's the ripples in the water. Finally, looking forward very quickly, what are some things we think are not going to be around technologically in the near future or otherwise? Candy, anything come to mind?
Yeah, we're gonna have to drive our own cars. The cars now are coming out. You can sit back and drive.
Not ready for that. Nadia, what do you think?
I think with the way media is going and things that are happening, I seriously wonder if we're going to know in the news, in even in real life, in a lot of places, what is even real anymore.
Yeah, I may be a hologram talking right now. Rashida, anything come to mind for you?
I would say technology is going to evolve so much where we won't have to have an actual phone. We can just press our temple and begin to talk and have conversations.
Hey, well, Mike, anything come to your mind?
Sure, Candy's cars will be flying through the air.
Well, anyway, everything's accelerating at such a pace, we're going to have to be ready for these things. And so, fellow time travelers, both on screen and at home, thank you for being here today. And we look forward to seeing you again in our next episode of Generations.